Hello everyone and welcome to the second Patreon video editing tutorial. I thank you so much for pledging to the Patreon and for supporting the content. It really does mean the world to me. Today we're going to go over this kind of effect that you've seen me use quite a bit before, using this 3D camera to make a, 3D scene, if you will, for infographics or displaying information. There's a lot of ways to do the same thing, but some of it does come down to graphic design and personal preference. There was also a version of this as well in the Jin video. In the most recent Jin documentary, there was a scene in a second here that, kind of looked like this, where some information comes on screen and shows his picks and band rate and all that kind of stuff, and then some really cool infographics with the 3D camera kind of moving across the scene. There's a lot of cool ways to do this, and I wanted to show you this. Now, the only thing is, if you haven't seen the previous video editing tutorial, I really need you and recommend you to check that out. In the previous tutorial, we went over the basics of the 3D camera within After Effects, and that will be useful. I'll do my best to keep that, in mind if some of you haven't seen it. Now, that being said, this is a somewhat intermediate tutorial because we're going to be creating something that involves not just using this 3D camera, but also involves using things like track mats, alpha mats, even masks and stuff like that. So I'll say that this is an intermediate tutorial. You need to be fairly familiar with After Effects, but as always, I will keep it as beginner friendly as possible. Now, the first thing that we'll do is we will set up the explanation comps. Now, you will not need to do this in your project if you want to follow along, but I want to do this to show you sort of some of the effects that we'll be working with today. And that way, towards the end, once it all comes together, you can actually kind of watch it in a sped up way, or that we can move faster once it kind of pieces all together. So I'll actually use an explanation for each of the different effects. So as I said, let's just make a new composition and let's call it 3D camera tutorial. And again, this is just going to be to show the things that are possible with the 3D camera and how to use it. Standard 1920 by 1080, 30 FPS, and 15 seconds. Let's just hit OK. That's fine. And we will finish the tutorial in the main tutorial comp. But let's first make a new solid, and this is just going to be our background. We can call it BG, and I figured I would just show you a cool way to make a quick background. Pretty easy. You just go on your solid. If you wanted to give it just a fill, it's possible to do that. You can type in fill, generate fill, and drag it on there. And you can pick whatever color you may want. So if you just wanted a standard solid color background, it's totally possible to do that. But you can do something a little bit more interesting as well. If we just go ahead and delete that fill, we can also give it a gradient ramp. And that is always a lot of fun. And this is a cool way to make a background. So let's just say we made this kind of, let's say we wanted to go for like kind of a hot pink into maybe a darker red kind of, that's pretty cool. Maybe we won't end up using this, but this is pretty cool nonetheless. One more thing you can do is also use the 4-color gradient. So if we drag that on there and delete our other gradient ramp, we can use the 4-color gradient, and this is a very cool way to make some cool colors. So you can do, I like to do the corners, and I learned this on a editing tutorial here on YouTube as well. So you can do like a dark blue in this corner, and then in this corner you can do another dark blue. And then in the other corners, let's try a really light blue. Yeah, almost something like that. Not super light, I guess, but something like that. And then again, it's kind of something like that. That's pretty interesting. That's pretty unique. Kind of a cool way to make a gradient. And of course, the cool thing about this is that it's completely customizable. How much you want to blend and all that kind of stuff. You can move around. You can move the centers. So it's a 4-color gradient, meaning that you can move the positions of where the gradients start. So by doing this, once you can kind of move around, you can see how these different colors interact with each other and how you make a gradient. But this is a cool way to make a quick background if that's something that you want to do. Now, in our case, we will be making a background that involves using a picture and the tint effect. So what I've done instead is I have found this official wallpaper from League of Legends, and this is a very cool background for Summoner's Rift. We can just bring this in, and if we press S on our keyboard, we can bring up the scale. It was just a little bit too widescreen, so we'll bring that up. And now that we have this, can go ahead and give this the tint effect. And what tint will actually do is it will change it to a monochrome black and white. And you can even adjust the color of the tint. So you can hit map black to, which means it changes the blacks of the image, the dark parts of the image, to a different color. So let's say we wanted to give this a blue tint. Look at that. So we can pick a dark blue, and for the whites, could maybe even pick a light blue or something like that if you wanted. I prefer to kind of just do white when you map the whites to white. I think it looks a little bit nicer. You could even swap the colors if you wanted to be crazy, but of course we won't do that. And you can do amount to tint. So let's say we wanted a soft color on this. Could start at 0 and maybe crank it up to about 60. So it just has a very soft but noticeable blue hue or blue tint. I think it looks better in this case to have it at 100%, and you'll see why in just a second. Let's also then down at the bottom, right click and make a new solid. And by doing that, we should also give it a fill. And we can do that now. Again, drag fill on top of there. And the reason for doing this, you'll see in just a sec. Let's make it a very dark blue and drag that below. And then what we can do is drop the opacity of this thing so it fades a little bit more into the blue and is more like a texture for the blue solid. And if you really wanted to, of course, you could change this. Instead of a fill, we could go back to the gradient ramp, which we talked about. And we could give this, let's say, a dark blue at the top and maybe closer to black at the bottom. And now we have this very, very interesting background. There's a lot of customization here. You can do whatever you see fit. You can make it all red. You can go ahead and change the tint to red, and you can make a red gradient. Let's just try that for a second. Let's go there. And then go ahead and change this red tint. I mean, there's just so much customization. You just need to know a couple of the effects that you have at your disposal here, and you can make some very cool, interesting, unique things, whatever you want to do with your background. Totally possible and up to you. So now that we have this is just going to be our background. Let's just mess around with the 3D camera just as a quick refresher. So let's make some new text, call it text. What we can do to easily center this is that if you don't see the align window, you can go up to window align. And by being on the align window and clicking on the text, you can center it perfectly in the middle of your composition. That's going to be the align horizontally and align vertically button. Then you can just scale it up. And by scaling it up, you'll have to just realign it if you need to. If you want to avoid doing that extra step, you'll see that there is a little kind of anchor point here. And in order to bring that right in the center of your text, you can hit Control, double click. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what it would be on a Mac. I think maybe Option, double click, or maybe Command, double click to put it right in the center. But by doing that, by putting the anchor point in the center, now that we scale up and scale down, our text will scale perfectly and stay in the middle. Now that we have our text in the middle, let's close all this up by hitting Control A and U a couple of times. If you need to close it up, if you have any effects, you'll eventually close all that kind of stuff up. And then what we can do is right click and give ourselves a new camera. And then we will also right click and give a new null object. Let's go ahead and rename this null object to camera control because that's what we're going to do with it. Again, if you missed the last tutorial, the most important part about the last tutorial, I believe, is how to manipulate and use the 3D camera. But basically, you need to make a null object to get the best use out of controlling the camera, and then parent by using this parent and link pick whip and drag the camera onto the null object. Now what we'll do is make sure that all of our layers are 3D by pressing this button. If you don't see this 3D button, you can simply just click the toggle switches and modes to find the 3D button. And then by doing that, let's press P on our keyboard to bring up position, and let's press Shift R to bring up the position and the rotation at the same time. If we were just to press R or just to press P, it will only have one of them open at the same time. But by pressing, if we say start with R and then press Shift P, it will have all of our settings up at once, which is what we want. Now that we have all these settings, we can just move around and manipulate. So we can drag this closer, we can use the X rotation, we can use the Y rotation, and even bring up the position. And so you can see what the 3D camera does by making all these layers 3D, and by messing with these 3D layers, you can mess around with the camera. And the cool thing, of course, is that you can, as always, keyframe it. So if we hold down and click on all of these keyframes, and then let's go across to about, I don't know, 8 seconds, move across, rotate back this way, rotate, of course, using the Y, move around, and move over to this side. Yep, that looks pretty cool. Now we have this kind of effect where our text and our background rotate around each other. And they're all embedded in this sort of effect. You can easily see that all of it works together because the background is very different from the text. It's a dark blue color, and then the text is very, it kind of shows quite nicely on this background. If you wanted to do one more additional effect, you could actually give this text, if we go back to our effects and presets, we could give it a drop shadow. By giving our text a drop shadow, it will then, you'll see what it does. It gives it, of course, a shadow, which is nice, but then if we increase the softness and then increase the opacity, now the text, if I turn off the effect, you can see quite a bit. It does add quite a lot to make it, distinct from the background. I think it looks quite nice. As always, we can press this button down here, which will move the composition, move the viewer window to exactly the size that we want. So by hitting fit up to 100%, we can actually see our effect. Now let's make another composition to understand how masking works and how these alpha mats, these weird terms that when I was first starting with After Effects kind of confused me a little bit, but eventually once I got the hang of it, I realized their full potential. So we'll right click and create a new composition, and we'll call this mask/mat tutorial. And everything else the same, and we'll hit OK. Let's quickly just make a background, and I'm going to speed through this since, of course, you know how to make a background now. I'll go name it background. I'll give it a, let's do this time just to try. Let's give it a 4-color gradient, and just to practice using this a little bit different. And let's try a different color this time. Maybe we'll stick with this yellow. Maybe we'll have a dark. I actually don't like yellow too much. Let's do like an orange, shall we? We'll have like a dark orange up in the top, maybe, yeah, a color like that. And then what we can do is on this side, we can grab the eyedropper tool and click up there, which will make it a little bit faster. And then in the corners, we'll match the colors nice and easy. And we have some kind of orange background. Looks a little bit weird. I'm not a big fan of it, but that's okay. We'll just, we'll mess around with it. And now we have a quick background. Then we'll make, again, a new text, and we'll call it text. In order to center it, once again, we go up to our align window, center horizontally, align vertically, and we will double click to put our anchor point in the middle. We can press S to scale up, and we can scale up our text, and it looks quite nice. Now let's start messing around with mats. So what does that word mean? A lot of the times if you watch an After Effects tutorial, you might hear something like an alpha mat, a track mat, a mask. What do these things truly mean? What does it actually mean? Well, let's make a new solid, and let's go ahead and call this our mat. What this does and what it will eventually do, I'll turn off the layer so we can still see our text. This will become a sort of mask. If you've ever done Photoshop, you've ever done masking of any type, maybe I'll pull up an image on Google just to give you an idea. Okay, so this is a pretty cool image. So you have this idea of Photoshop masking, where in this example, in this wedding photo, they have masked out the sides. They have made it, kind of an oval shape and masked out the edges of the image. Looks pretty interesting. Instead, doing this actually on After Effects, there's a lot of things that you can do with solids and making them mats. So we have our solid here. Let's go up to make sure we are actually selected on our new solid layer that we've named matte. Go up to the rectangle tool, and what this will do is draw a mask of a solid. It's still our solid, but now what we've done by turning the mask on and off, on and off or decreasing the opacity, this is our new solid size, which is pretty cool. We can also hit inverted if we really wanted to, and it will invert everything but the mask. But in this case, we actually want it to be here. And then let's do something interesting. Let's bring this just barely above our text. Now that we have this solid above our text, let's toggle the switches and modes and let's change the text. If you see this mode called the track matte, let's change it to an alpha matte. And oh no, everything went away. What happened? Well, what happened is that first off, this layer was turned into a matte. So our matte layer disappeared on purpose. That's good. That's actually what we want. We don't want this big black solid on our screen. It will automatically turn off the visibility of it, which is exactly what we want. But why did our text disappear? That's a very interesting question. Well, it's because we have decided in that we want it to be an alpha matte, meaning that our text will not appear. If you remember where our text was, if I just undo, our text will not appear if it is not within the boundaries or inside of our new matte shape. So by clicking alpha matte, this means that if you see the boundaries of our shape here, our text does not appear because it is not inside of this matte. However, if we press P on our text and we move our text up, look at that. Our text actually does start to appear inside of our shape, which is exactly what we want. Now, there's also another way to do this. This effect called alpha matte, you can actually hit alpha inverted matte, which means that our text will only appear if it is outside of our shape. And in this case, with how we've designed the shape, in the sense that it goes up and above the screen and it's on top of our text, and this is a case where alpha inverted would be quite nice, because what we could do is a sort of effect where, let's say we keyframe this. Let's go to about 3 seconds. Let's hit the keyframe on position, and we'll go back to 2 seconds, and we will move our text up. And now what we have is a text animation where our text drops down and it is revealed by leaving the boundaries of the alpha matte. It looks pretty darn cool. We can make this text animation nicer by making it shorter. First off, it should be about a half a second. And then what we can do is we can highlight over all of our keyframes. We can right click, go to keyframe assistant, easy ease, and this will make it even nicer. And that's a pretty nice effect. So that looks super cool, and it's a cool way to use mattes. So again, the reason why we chose inverted is just because of the way that we designed our shape layer. Let's actually delete this, and let's delete this animation, and instead let's go through an example where we would want to actually use the normal, not inverted. So let's call this matte. Let's make a new solid. We don't have the mask or anything yet. Let's turn this off just for 1 second, and let's go ahead and draw on our shape. Let's actually draw a shape layer like this. So by doing this, you can see where, in this case, alpha matte, not inverted, works better, because now what we needed to do is enter the boundaries of our shape. Because our shape looks like this and is not some big box from off the screen, but instead it's actually on the text, or at least where we want our text to be, it makes more sense to do an alpha matte, not an alpha inverted. That way it will actually appear once it enters the boundaries of our shape and it doesn't leave the boundaries of our shape. Alright, so now that we have everything, we've covered the alpha mattes, we have covered the 3D camera and making a background. Let's bring it all together. I actually like this background. Let's just say we wanted to use it. Maybe what I'll do is I'll come back into this 3D camera tutorial comp. I'll press Control A and I'll close everything up with the U key. And let's go to the opacity of this and maybe drop this down just a little bit. I think it was a little too revealing, about 14% opacity. The way that you open up the opacity, by the way, is you press T on your keyboard. It's not O, actually, it's T for opacity, which is a little confusing, but you'll get the hang of it if you mess around with it for a while. Let's close up everything. Let's delete camera and camera control, and let's even delete our text, because all we want out of this composition is we want the background. So this is going to be changed. Now that we're done with the 3D camera tutorial, let's rename this to background comp. And you'll see why in just a second. This is just going to be our new background, because I actually kind of like the one that we made for testing. We essentially don't need this one, so let's close this up, and we can even delete this because we don't need this composition anymore. So now by going back into our main tutorial composition, this will be our final render composition. We can go ahead and drag in background comp. That way we have on one layer pre-composed, meaning that these two layers, now that they're pre-composed, have become one layer, and is now our background pre-comp. Looks pretty nice, and now that we have a very cool background, let's go ahead and recreate, and let's make a new camera. So that's cool. And let's create a new null object and press enter on your keyboard to rename and call it camera control. You don't have to rename it to camera control, of course. You can just use the null object one. Let's also make sure that we click our parent and link in our pick whip tool and pick whip the camera to camera control. That way we can actually manipulate the 3D camera, as well as make sure that all our layers are clicked for 3D. And let's make one more thing, and let's make a new text, and let's call this, just because it'll look a little bit nicer and look more like a real project, let's call it, I don't know, let's call it pick rate, and let's maybe do 45%. If we want to move this into the middle, we can go up to align and align it in the middle so it's a little easier to see. And we will go up to our anchor point and we will control double click to move the anchor point to the middle. And this on your screen, by the way, is just the null object. It's a little annoying that these guides are always there. You can just turn off the visibility of the null object if it bothers you. Now what we will do is bring in our final element that we need. Let's bring in like a splash art or some way to kind of show off masking and to show a cool kind of circle effect where we have like a piece of art or whatever, or some kind of source. I brought in this Master Yi splash art from League of Legends, of course. I think it looks pretty cool. Because this scene is slightly busy and we've got a little bit going on here, let's practice. We can actually show how to solo a layer. This dot here, this little button, if you click on it, we'll just make it for the time being. That way we only see this layer. So let's go ahead and zoom in on his face, and let's make sure we're clicked on the artwork, of course, or our layer that we need, whatever layer we're working with. We will hold down, left click, and grab our ellipse tool from our shape tools. And then let's see if we can't find, yeah, something like that. To make it a perfect circle, just hold down shift, and there. Look at that. That is pretty cool. Let's unsolo all of our layers, and there we go. We have this pretty cool kind of effect here. Let's control double click to center our anchor point, and again, that is useful because once we go to scale by pressing S, it will scale perfectly from its center. Had we not done that or moved the anchor point, look at the way it will scale. It will scale based on this anchor point position. So before we do anything with the camera effect, it is going to be more efficient and a little bit easier to make our track mats and go ahead and do the masking, because once we start working with the camera tool, we essentially have to kind of see things in a, I guess, distorted or tilted angle. So let's just do, while we have everything flat and simple, let's do our masking. What I need to do really quickly is make sure that all our layers are 3D layers by clicking that button, which is fine. Let's control A and U to shrink everything down. And let's go up to pick rate and Master Yi as well. And let's do 2 different mats for each of them. So I'll make a new solid, and let's call this text mat, text underscore mat, and let's make one more new solid by right clicking, and let's call it Master Yi mat. Okay, so we have 2 different mats for each of them. Let's turn off the Master Yi one because we're not going to use that in just a sec, or for just a sec. And let's grab our rectangle tool and let's find, okay, so we need around something like this. Need to draw over our pick rate. Let's see how that looks. That look pretty good? Yeah, that looks great. And again, in this case, if you remember correctly, because we're drawing pretty much on top of what we want and on top of our subject, that means in this case, it is important to use the regular alpha mat, not the alpha inverted. What we need to also make sure of is where this layer is positioned on our composition. So let's go ahead and grab our text mat and make sure it's right above the text, because that's how you need to do it. Then let's make our mat a 3D layer by clicking 3D, and then we will also go to our pick rate. We'll toggle the switches and modes and turn it on alpha mat. So by doing that, pretty cool, we can then see that if we move up our text, it disappears. Nice and cool. Pretty sweet effect. So what we'll do is we'll go to about 2.5 seconds, and we will click keyframe on the current position that we want for our effect, or for our final position. We'll go back about a second and we will drag this guy up. So now we have our pick rate coming in. It looks like it's not even, it's technically like from here, but because we have this cool mat, it just looks like it appears on our screen. Pretty darn cool. Let's quickly do the Master Yi one as well, and then we will clean up these keyframes. And maybe we'll grab the rectangle tool again. And nope, a little too far. Let's, I guess, do something like that. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Let's drag this Oh, sorry, it's actually already right above our art or whatever, which is what we want. And let's click alpha matte, and there we go. That's pretty cool. In fact, let's move this matte. Let's actually drag this guy and make sure we're clicked on our layer, and let's just move it over a bit, and you'll kind of see why. I'll hold shift, that way it's perfect. And by moving it over, yeah, actually I shouldn't even do that. I can actually just grab the side here and bring it in. Because what I want to do is actually move this over. That way it pretty much only starts to appear, if I press P on my keyboard to find it, it only starts to appear just to the right. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Just to the right of the pick rate. Pretty darn cool. So our pick rate finishes at around right there. So we'll have this kind of offset and finish just after it. So our pick rate finishes there. So let's have this finish right about now. So we'll click on our position keyframe, we'll click there. We'll go back about a second and start there. So how does that look? So that looks pretty cool. We'll clean up these keyframes. Let's have this be a little faster. Let's bring these keyframes together just a bit. And there we go. So now to make this look so much better, there's a few things that we'll do. Firstly, let's find the pick rate and let's find Master Yi, and we'll press U on our keyboard. Let's actually speed this one up as well. And so speeding up the keyframes always makes them look better so that the animation is quicker, but we will highlight all of our keyframes and we will press F9 on our keyboard. F9 is the same exact thing as hitting right click, keyframe assistant, easy ease. That's the shortcut. So we'll press F9 on our keyboard. And by doing that, that already looks so much better. It will have momentum behind it, but there's even more that we can do. What we will also do is we will do it individually just so it's easier to see, but you don't have to do it individually. You can highlight over a set of keyframes and press the graph editor button. We can also right click to make sure we're on the edit speed graph, and we can highlight our graph and grab the end point here, and we can even hold shift and drag this guy kind of almost like an L shape and drag it to be like a roller coaster, if you will, and this will really add momentum to this guy. Look at this animation now. It is basically just, if you watch it, it's pretty much just you know, all the momentum is being like exported like right away, or it's happening right away super fast. Looks like it has a lot of momentum, and then it eases into its position. So we'll do the same for our pick rate as well. We'll close the graph editor, we will open this guy up, we will click the graph editor, make sure we're on right click edit speed graph, not the value graph, grab our graph, and we will hold shift and pull this together. And now let's check our final animation here, and what do we got? Man, that is pretty. Let's go back just a bit and let's check this. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, let's exit our speed graph. And the final thing we'll do before we're ready to do the camera animation is make sure we're on all these layers, anything that we're going to show. And as I showed before, let's just grab we don't need to do it on the matte, so let's just go to our pick rate and let's go to effects and presets and let's grab a drop shadow. So we'll grab drop shadow, put that on the pick rate, and we'll do Master Yi as well. Drag it on there, and let's increase the opacity to 100%, increase the softness a little bit. And in fact, what we can do is, if we like this one, let's just Control C and copy this drop shadow. We'll go to pick rate, we'll delete this one, and then Control V and place the same drop shadow for both of them. So you now see the drop shadow effect that we have. Might be hard to see with YouTube rendering, but there you go. You can actually see that pretty well. The final thing that we'll do, and then I promise we'll get to the camera animation. Let's highlight all our layers and let's press this motion blur button right here and click the motion blur toggle as well. And so we'll let this render out, but you'll see what this does. This actually gives motion blur to our effect. I recommend always turning this on at the very end of your project and when you're completely done, because it does take up some render time and it'll take up some processing power, but by doing it at the end, you can just worry about it at the very end when you're done and ready for rendering. So now we are ready for the 3D camera animation. So what we'll do is we'll have this end at about 6 seconds. Our animation finishes at 3 seconds or so. So this will go on for 6 seconds. Let's start by make sure all our layers are 3D. We need all our layers to be 3D. Go to the camera control, our null object, and press P and Shift R. And then we will click all these keyframes, so that way we mark this first position. And let's just zoom our composition in. And then we will have our X rotation. That looks cool. And bring it there. And now let's see relative to where we are. Where is all our stuff? Okay, so our stuff is all the way over there. So if we drag out to 6 seconds and have this come across, looks cool. Move it down. Use the Y rotation to rotate back across. Looks pretty interesting. And then maybe have it there, and maybe the slightest X rotation, or sorry, Z rotation. I don't usually like to use Z rotations. Maybe I'll do like -2. Just a smallest angle of Z rotation. Just a little bit more dynamic, I guess. And it looks like we want this to happen a little bit faster because you'll see that by the time the animation is done, which is there, we can't even see the whole thing. So we do want the whole thing. So we'll have this come and end at about 5 seconds, and we'll bring this over more dramatically. We'll bring this over as kind of a pan across, and we'll bring this guy over. So now it should be mostly on screen. Yeah, it looks like even just a little bit faster, and we'll be good to go. And I'll have this render out, and we'll see what it looks like. So there we go. That took about 2 minutes or so, or about 90 seconds to render out on full quality. I like to sometimes wait, but you definitely don't have to. You can just drop the quality to maybe a half or third. I recommend almost everything you do to work in these lower qualities, unless you're doing like blurring or something like that. But let's see what this looks like with the full quality. That is so cool. How about that? Doesn't that look pretty cool? In doing this, there were quite a few effects that were used. You know, it was manipulating the 3D camera. There was some masking involved with the splash art, as well as the track mats and stuff like that, and a couple of different gradient effects to make the background. But overall, I feel pretty happy with this final product. I think that it mostly was what I wanted out of it. And, you know, if you know the steps and you know the effects, it doesn't take too long to put something like this together. Let's go ahead and add one more thing, which is a vignette. And it's pretty easy. I always show this in my tutorials to add a quick vignette. We'll add one more solid, and we'll call it new solid, and we'll call it vignette. Make sure it's black. Actually, it matters what color it is this time, but let's make sure it's a vignette. Black. Let's go up to our ellipse tool, and we will control double click. And then by doing that, it makes this big oval that's perfectly fit to our comp size. And we'll click inverted, go down to our mask properties and feather this guy and have mask expansion up and drop the opacity just a bit. And that again, maybe I even want a little bit more feather. Yeah, that's kind of cool. So by doing this, again, it's just a little bit more texture to your scene. You've got the corners kind of, you know, darkened and put together. And now your scene just has a little more texture to it. But anyway, I mean, that's pretty much everything that I wanted to show here. I hope that you guys enjoyed this kind of 3D scene for infographics. There's more that you could do, which I will probably show next time. It's a little bit more complicated. You can technically have this number pick rate kind of count up and stuff like that, and you could even have a sort of progress bar. But I just wanted to show this example because I'd had a lot of different things to it since we made the background, since we kind of made this this circle for Master Yi or whatever. There was a few things that I wanted to show in this, but if there's anything else, let me know that you guys would like to see, and maybe I could make a part 2 to this to add even more effects.